On August 20th, 2025, the US Department of Transportation announced that they had discovered something very strange: radios hidden inside the inverters and batteries of solar-powered highway systems, like signs, cameras, and charging stations for electric vehicles. The likely culprit? China. Now, why would China be hiding radios in batteries and inverters? Welcome to Buried Origins. Today we'll explain exactly that. So let's get into it. Essentially, security analysts suspect that China is rigging the batteries in inverters so that it can transmit a signal which would cause them to go haywire, overloading the system and taking it offline while permanently damaging the inverter or battery in the process. Essentially, China has placed a kill switch in some of the hardware it manufactures. And it's not only limited to the highway infrastructure. Back in May, experts in the US noticed that the inverters and batteries in general solar infrastructure feeding into the power grid also had radios hidden in their systems. So it seems like China is attempting to rig US infrastructure with a kill switch. A kill switch that could shut down parts of the power grid and cause havoc to critical infrastructure like highways would give China a valuable weapon to use against the US in the event of a conflict. It would allow China to make everyday Americans experience hardship as a direct consequence of their government's actions, bringing the conflict home in a very real way and potentially weakening domestic support for continuing the conflict with China. The revelation that China is developing such capability is actually not brand new. Back in May 2025, the concerns were reported for the first time, and a former head of the National Security Agency, Mike Rogers, acknowledged that China places value in holding US infrastructure at risk. That same month, hidden radios were also found in Chinese-manufactured energy infrastructure in Denmark, indicating that China may possibly be pursuing a similar campaign in Europe, although we don't have any evidence beyond the Denmark example. But the threat is serious enough that Lithuania and Estonia have banned Chinese hardware from their industrial solar facilities, and the UK is launching an investigation into its own energy infrastructure. Now, this is a big deal for Europe, because about 200 of Europe's roughly 338 gigawatts of solar power generation are linked to Chinese-made inverters. And Europe has made huge efforts to transition to renewable energy, with roughly 9% of its overall electricity consumption coming from solar power. Now, that doesn't seem like that much, but power grids are fairly fragile. A large unplanned burst of electricity or drop can cause a failure that leads to a cascade, which can crash an entire grid, something that happened in April this year in Spain. While it's unknown to what degree Chinese-manufactured inverters are compromised, the EU has plans to continue installing them in its solar grid, as it seems Europe is prioritizing cost savings over security. Now, for the US, it's in a much better position. It still has a large reliance on Chinese manufacturing for its solar industry since China dominates the sector globally. Hence, 39% of US solar modular capacity is built by Chinese companies. But the US has been much slower to pivot towards solar energy, so solar only makes up 1% of its national energy consumption. That might explain why this isn't a bigger story, because the US doesn't rely on solar, so a threat to that energy source isn't much of a threat at all. It's already taken steps to ensure that its military and government agencies don't rely on Chinese manufactured batteries and inverters, and it's focusing on what it considers more pressing concerns, like banning Chinese vehicles from the US, limiting Chinese influence operations through TikTok, and preventing Chinese hardware from being used in critical sectors like communication, hence the ban on Huawei 5G hardware. Those are all vectors through which Beijing could cause a lot more disruption than shutting down solar power and disrupting highway signs and EV charging stations. On top of all of that, the news cycle has of course been absolutely dominated by other events since May, so stories like these can easily get lost. But you might be surprised that a possible sabotage operation like this isn't causing more of a stir. But when it comes to intelligence and clandestine operations, this is actually fairly normal. Adversaries are always looking for ways to undermine each other and give themselves extra tools in the event of a crisis, and the US has been especially active in doing this. While negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program were playing out in the early 2010s, the US developed a cyber war plan called Nitro Zeus, which was meant to cripple the country, taking large parts of its electricity grid offline and disabling its air defenses. To do this, the US physically placed electronic implants in Iranian computer networks so that they wouldn't have to hack them later. It was an elaborate plan with extensive work done on the ground for a what-if scenario, very similar to China's possible attempt to place a kill switch in US and European power grids. But the plan was never implemented, of course, as diplomacy temporarily won the day. Now, if we go back to the Cold War, of course there are plenty of other examples, like Operation Mongoose, when the US sabotaged a vast array of critical Cuban industrial facilities and sabotaged its trade in an attempt to destabilize the government and damage Cuba's economy. Then there was the massive explosion of a Soviet pipeline in 1982 that one of Reagan's aides said was a US operation, caused by sabotaging the software that the Soviets had bought from the Canadians to manage the pipeline. In the modern day, Russia has some of the most obvious sabotage campaigns, like its campaign in the Baltic Sea, where it has been cutting underwater communication and electrical cables of NATO countries, using deniable tactics like having commercial ships drag their anchors over the seabed. But one of those ships was seized by Finnish forces late last year, and it was full of military equipment for tracking NATO ships, so that made it pretty obvious it was a Russian government operation. Then there was the 2017 Petya malware attack against Ukraine, when a Ukrainian tax accounting software was infected with malware that wreaked havoc across Ukrainian industries from airports to telecommunications to banks. And cybersecurity experts pointed the finger at Russia, of course. Then in terms of hiding things in electronic devices, we have a great example from late last year when Israel hid explosives inside pagers and radios that were sold to Hezbollah after establishing a fake supply chain. Then Israel detonated the devices and used the ensuing mayhem to launch a military offensive. The list goes on, but it's all just to say that hostile countries do stuff like this all the time. So the revelation that China may possibly be attempting to place a vulnerability in the US and European power grids isn't as shocking as you might think. And even if we take the scenario of a massive operational success, it's still extremely risky for China. Because when you target a population in an attempt to demoralize it, you may just as easily motivate them against you and cause a rally around the flag patriotic effect that only strengthens the adversary's government. But what this does show us is that China is probing Western countries for potential vulnerabilities it can exploit, and it's getting pretty inventive with how to do so. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please like and subscribe. See ya.